Good evening, I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. There's a potential big story, rumblings in Sabah that there could be a change in the state government. Now that story is still developing. We're going to be keeping a very close eye on the situation there. However, in other news, today, Deputy Human Resource Minister Awang Salahuddin told the Dewan Rakyat that foreign workers can only be employed in 3 sectors: construction, agriculture and plantations. This, according to the Deputy Minister, is to ensure that Malaysians will have jobs, but it's also part of that plan by the government to reduce the intake of foreign workers. Now, my question is, I really wonder whether this policy is actually, or this statement is going to make a clear distinction between foreign workers and expats. I mean, is this restriction only for what the government considers low-skilled foreign workers and not for high-skilled expats?
Melissa, well, this was said at Parliament. I don't know if there's enough clarity as to whether this is a full-blown policy statement based on some sort of evidence or new data, but it does sound strikingly familiar to many iterations of this let's move foreign workers out and allow Malaysians to move in a narrative that's been spun on several occasions. And I wonder again whether there was sufficient consultation with the stakeholders in those sectors now being told that they can't take foreign workers, say for instance in manufacturing.
Right.
So whether they are expats or not, I don't think it's the issue. The question is, if foreign workers at whatever level are integrated into our economy, how do you now take them out without disrupting the current situation? Well, I don't know if there's a plan, is the granular plan for that?
Correct. The idea is perhaps to limit the intake. So as we understand it, that the hiring of foreign workers has been frozen till at least the end of the year, and perhaps this is indicative of the government's thinking in considering allowing for intake of new foreign workers, whether it's going to be limited to just these sectors. I'm curious, you mentioned manufacturing, the E&E sector also hires a lot of foreign workers. I'm very curious to know why F&B services were also missed out from this. F&B sector, cleaning, janitorial services, that's all missed out from this list of 3. But what we know of 3D jobs essentially is not that locals aren't drawn to it because of the pay or because we consider them lazy, consider the jobs dirty, or because we're lazy, but also because we know that these sectors often are conducive to exploitation of labor, of workers. So perhaps there is a real need to reform our labor laws to ensure that there is equitable, fair practices across the board, that wages are also fair. These are the things that perhaps we can have a discussion about as opposed to just limiting intake of foreign workers. Yeah,
well, this is a bit of deja vu when it comes to talking about the labor sector, right, and policies around it. But Melissa, again, we're back to the question of whether there's a one-on-one correspondence with, workers. I mean, if you have been working and lost your job as a manager of a factory because demand's gone down or the COVID situation, whatever it is, then what is the right job for you next? So is it just any job that comes along? And age, I think, is also another issue that needs to be kind of worked into any of these policies. Definitely. Because if you're older, what kind of suitability will you have for the new jobs? So we always talk about the young. We don't talk about those who are kind of mid-career or even older, who might still have a huge amount of financial commitments to work out before they are ready for retirement.
All right. Well, let's take a look at some of the interesting comments that came out from the Dewan Rakyat today. Permatang Power MP Nurul Izzah Anwar, she called on policymakers to recogniise the link between poverty and crime. And she said that this must be reflected in the 12th Malaysia Plan. Now, echoing Puchong MP Gobind Singh Dio, Nurul Izzah also said that the criminal justice system penalises the poor. She also called for an overhaul of our prison system, pointing out that they are severely overcrowded. So our prisons were designed to accommodate 52,000 inmates. But right now, they house more than 80,000. That is a severe overpopulation in the prison.
Yeah, and remember during the Pakatan Harapan time, Melissa, there was a discussion precisely about who these 80,000 are. And many of them were taken in on minor drug offenses. And there was this real desire on the part of the previous administration to de-link drug use with criminality and to recognize it as a medical and social issue, right? And so by decriminalizing certain types of drug use, not the trafficking of drugs, not the pushing of drugs, but those people who use it, you will actually allow for many of the prison inmates to leave that situation and go into facilities that are actually much more conducive for their rehabilitation. And now you deal with a less crowded prison system where you can start to deal with these issues that you're talking about.
But even before, you get to decriminalizing, right? That Nur Izzah pointed to the criminal justice system, perhaps penalizing the poor. And I thought that was really interesting to look at because, we've all heard of many cases where those from the low-income group, they're thrown in jail because they've stolen a tin of sardines or a tin of Milo. And those are the things that I think we have to look at because perhaps those people may not have, access to afford to hire a lawyer or such. And these are the ones that perhaps we should be looking at in terms of sentencing.
Actually, it's very disturbing when you read media reports of people who are unrepresented. I know the Bar Council has a legal aid program and people ought to be represented at any of these hearings, but far too many people go into the courts without legal representation, perhaps being, counseled by certain parties to plead guilty as a way of lessening the harshness of the response. So people might not be even getting a sense of their own legal rights, and because they fear they have no access to lawyers and such, that they kind of give up on these rights. And therefore, we, again, like you say, I mean, the whole system, the criminal justice system has to be looked at, including sentencing, make sure that it's fair across the board, and that the rich and well-heeled and well-represented are not somehow let off the hook.
Right. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. But after this, we will be joined in the studio by a Bersatu Supreme Council member. And we're going to be discussing the continuing political fallout from yesterday's verdict. That's all coming up in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kuttan. The political fallout continues following the conviction and sentencing of former Prime Minister Najib Razak yesterday. Now we see heightened tensions between parties in the ruling Perikatan Nasional Coalition. Joining us on the show tonight to discuss this further, we have Datuk Rais Hussein Muhammad Arif. Datuk Rais Hussein Muhammad Arif, he is a member of the Supreme Council of Bersatu, the party of the Prime Minister. He's also the chairman of MDEC and president and CEO of MR Research. Rais, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Having me here.
Okay, so does UMNO blame Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin for what transpired yesterday? Has the relationship between the two parties soured?
I do not think there is a political fallout as such. I think it is more of voicing out their differing views from the within the party. Let's take, for instance, UMNO. Even within the UMNO, there are differing views and differing reactions to the conviction of Dato Sri Najib yesterday. My view is that this thing will be probably appealing to their own support base. If they don't say anything, there is a problem. If they say something, there is a problem. And some of them took a little bit higher plane. Like for instance, Khairi Jamaluddin MP, he talked about moving forward. And I think, again, for the sake of the country, for the sake of the nation, the people, UMNO should start thinking about moving on.
Okay, well, this remark that Khairi made got a rather sarcastic response by Najib Razak himself. And if you look at some of the, responses, right, we've had Fard Zakasi, we had, I think, Lokman Adam, who've come out, who actually draw a direct line between the judgment up to Dr. Mahathir, saying that Mahathir was pulling the strings. All this might seem rather fanciful. And if it does, in fact, is about playing to the ground and appeasing the UMNO faithful, then how will this be for the long term, especially if the parties UMNO, PAS and Bersatu are going to form a coalition going into the next election or being the core of this government?
I think we need to also understand that there are two factors or two sides to these stories, right? So you have one faction who sarcastic, who raise issues, sometimes very emotionally devoid of some ground realities. The other faction is someone who says that, look, it has happened, went through 100 days of hearing, 50-something witnesses, the prosecution had hundreds of pages, the defense had thousands of pages, went through all the deliberation, the judge looked and took into consideration, and then he found a verdict that is what we all know today as a conviction of Dato Sri Najib. So you have these two sides of the same coin. So we need to look at it not just to sensationalize one faction. We have another faction who talks about, like Ishamuddin, for instance. He said we need to be calm, we need to be cool, focus on the nation, focus on the people. KJ said that we need to move on, UMNO needs a new narrative, blah, 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 blah. And the other thing that I keep on reporting and saying, Malaysia is facing troika of challenges.
Okay.
Economic.
Rais, you addressed that you acknowledged that there are factions. What is being done to address that faction? Because that faction, the unhappy faction, they're loud.
I think the engagement, usually the unhappy factions will always be louder. I mean, that's a fact of life, right? The more unhappy you are, the more louder you would be. But I think there will be a consistent and constant constructive engagement between, I think, within UMNO, intra-UMNO, and then intra-Perikatan Nasional. I think it's very important that we do not lose focus on the country, on the nation, right? I think this is very important. Political coalition can come and go. We all saw how Pakatan Harapan emerged, won the election, right? And then we all saw how Perikatan Nasional came, right? And so coalition will keep on probably changing. But most importantly, what we need to be focused on is the country.
Okay, but and when you say the country, I guess we are looking at policy continuity or creativity or the best people for the job. Muhyiddin Yassin, when he took over government and formed Perikatan Nasional, talked about a technocratic government. This government, I think, by most people's account, is not technocratic. It is and has been somewhat bloated as compared to the Pakatan Harapan government. But let's take the Bersatu perspective on this, right? And since you are a Bersatu member, when your party and parliamentarship look out and they hear these voices coming up from UMNO, do they hear, the potential for UMNO to pull out its support from Perikatan Nasional? Are they worried that somehow this particular iteration of government might end as perhaps quicker than Pakatan Harapan?
I think we need to be rational about it. During such times like this, there will always be some emotional outbursts. Is it fairly representing the entire UMNO? Is it representing one half of the UMNO? Or is it 33% of the UMNO?
Well, it's coming from Najib Razak himself, who is said to be very powerful within the party, in command of much of the divisional chiefs of the party, with a huge or war chest or deep pockets, as some people suggest. And so he is a major player. So if he's unhappy, don't you think the fallout is going to be significant?
It is naturally that he will be unhappy with the verdict. I mean, that's obvious, right?
But will he be unhappy with the current government? Not the verdict, which is not, I guess the executive will say it did not interfere in the judiciary, and that must be the line of the current government. But will they somehow blame the Prime Minister and the current administration for somehow enabling this?
Some are very good and mastered at blaming others. So what can we do about that? From the Bersatu perspective, we have formed this Perikatan Nasional. We have worked very hard to get things done. We are combating the COVID-19, and we ensure that the COVID-19 Major General is somebody who is technocrat in the form of DG.
Well, that's a civil servant, not the Minister of Health, not the two deputies that we have.
We kept them away from that. We kept them away from that. So what we are trying to say is that...
but they're being paid for a job, and you're saying they've been kept away.
They've been kept away?
When I say talking about kept away means the leadership of managing the crisis was completely given to the DG. And he is doing a great job. And of course, not forgetting all the other people around, the frontliners, the police, the whoever, everyone.
What has the minister and his two deputies done?
Yeah, well, the ministers...
I mean, what exactly is their contribution?
If you ask me the contribution of the ministers and deputy ministers, frankly, I wouldn't know now how to respond to it because I do not know. But I'm sure they are looking at the policy matters, the policy issues, introducing the framework and, those kind of things. Enabling, for instance, the DG will say, I need this, and where do you get the budget from? The policy part, getting the budget part and all that. I think it is more on an administrative part. But in terms of implementation of those policies, this guy is in front. And I think the government is doing quite a good job. We all know that, yes, the administration have weaknesses, but in this area, the government is doing a good job to the recognition of even the world.
Okay.
So I think, yeah, so if there are some people who are unhappy in UMNO, it is expected so, because the problem is in Malaysia, we still have this leadership or leader-based institution, not institution.
Okay.
So that's a very important fact that we need to understand.
Well, let's come back and talk about that. We're going to take a quick break, but stay tuned to consider this. Thanks so much for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Supreme Council member of Bersatu, Rais Husin. Rais, all throughout this evening there have been a lot of rumblings from Sabah. There's been talk about the imminent fall of the state government there. And all this, I think, underscores this sense of this continued instability, that the country is perhaps in store for a long period of instability. Is that a fair comment to make? Do you agree that we have instability in our horizon?
I think political stability is very important for rebuilding of any nation, Malaysia included. And political instability can contribute to challenges that we do not necessarily go looking for it. I understand whenever there's a changeover of government through whatever means, as we saw here in Peninsula now on a federal level, then we are seeing now possibly in Sabah, it will contribute to a certain extent, the instability.
Do you think it will contribute to disenchantment in politics? Because if you remember, I mean, the man leading the charge in Sabah is a man who was had over 40 charges of corruption dropped only very recently. And in the minds of Malaysians, do you think they're making these links between a political, very politicized criminal justice system and politics and the need to capture state power?
I think a political fatigue has set into many people's minds. I mean, those who have been on the forefront of the politics have now start thinking, did I really make the right decision? And I've seen a sudden surge in these people who are actively involved in politics now taking up. Why is this happening? Because there's a continuous play of politics among the politicians. Right. So I keep on telling people, I keep on telling even the politicians, please, we need to focus on these three things: the economy, the pandemic, COVID-19, and we have to find some sense of stability in politics. If we don't, it will have a far-reaching implication for this country.
How do you do that? How do you ensure there is policy continuity, there is a consistent focus on economic recovery when everyone is so busy bickering about, and horse trading? So how do you do that?
August 2019, a little flashback. Hindi movies does have flashbacks.
We can do that.
So this is a flashback. In August 2019, in one of the seminars, I started talking about what Pakatan Harapan must do to avoid what happened eventually. And for that, I was openly reprimanded, rebuked by none other than my beloved Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad. But having said that, again, I just appeal to them. In terms of policy, we have very beautiful policies. I've seen a lot of policies engraved in such beautiful documents. Beautiful. When it comes to the execution, there's a huge hiatus, huge gap. And that's why even things like National Development Policy, we have a beautiful agriculture policy that we have, but it is not being executed.
Okay, but before we get even to the question of execution, we now have a shifting government. The Perikatan Nasional Government does not have a manifesto as Pakatan Harapan had, which even as the Prime Minister then, Dr. Mahathir, kind of like poo-pah'd it, it was in fact a horizon. You could see different ministries working at different... Now we have a government that doesn't seem to have a manifesto. It doesn't seem to have a horizon. How can that be addressed, Rais? And also, how can this current government achieve stability? Is there a need for realignment again? Do you see this in the crisis engendered by the verdict against Najib Razak? Do you see an opportunity for Perikatan to actually create more stability for itself rather than less?
My personal view is this. Yes, we had a beautiful manifesto, 8 months of laborious work, and unfortunately...
you were one of the key authors, weren't you?
Yes, but at the same time, unfortunately, whatever happened, and the manifesto took a backstage. However, having said that, Perikatan Nasional may not have specific manifesto as yet, but I think some of the things that they are doing is quite coherent with the previous manifesto, number one. Number two, I think in their minds, in the Perikatan Nasional minds, I'm not in the Perikatan Nasional's the main committee, in their minds, the theme that they are talking about is always Kerajaan Prihatin Rakyat. That means centered around people. So if you look at the policies and look at the actions that they have done so far, it has been always addressing the issues. Remember, when the COVID came in, March 18 onwards, we realized that immediately the first two things that we need to do is to survive the pandemic, and then restart. That means you survive, then you're ready to restart the economy. We are now at the restarting the economy phase. So I think we, Perikatan Nasional may not have a pronounced textbook of manifesto, but maybe they have a manifesto in action on a contingent plan.
Okay, so Prihatin Rakyat, as you claim it.
Kerajaan Prihatin Rakyat.
But we don't have a COVID bill. We do not have a bill that will address the need. I mean, we see Europe moving ahead. We see Singapore moving ahead with addressing that in terms of budget. You know, $1 trillion in Europe, and so on and so forth. We still don't have that, and that is the reason we don't have it because of politics, because of
the instability
and insecurity?
I think in terms of budgets, we, the Perikatan Nasional government have actually allocated budget. But
that's taken from the existing budget.
Correct, but it has been allocated. But if you ask for a specific budget, I think the parliamentary session is still on now, and I'm sure the MPs will start talking about this, start debating about this. At this point of time, they're still debating on the Royal's address.
Yes.
So perhaps after that it will come. But having said that, there were some stimulus packages that has been announced by the Prime Minister, and that stimulus package has 2-3 phases. Again, the key word is to survive the situation, the pandemic, because I mean it's an unprecedented situation that we are facing. So you have the survival mode, then you restart mode. So we are now going into the restart mode.
Rais, you said this is a Kerajaan Prihatin Rakyat. I'm just wondering, is Perikatan Nasional committed to institutional reform?
I think that is something I'm passionate about.
Are they passionate about it?
My belief is this. If any government or party, or for that matter anything, is centered on one leader, then you're doomed to fail. But if you build, strengthen, reform institution, then you will reach that stability that everyone looking for. The institution must be built, not on individual base. That's number one. Number two, the institution must be independent. That's very important.
But is that happening today? I mean, we have a government that has perhaps a 2 or 3 seat majority, and there's so much talk about the legitimacy of this government. Is it possible for Perikatan Nasional to change the narrative, to draw in more support, not be so divisive, and in fact find a national consensus? Can this government do that?
I think the national consensus and national reconciliation is very, very important for any administration to administer a country like Malaysia, multi-religion, multi-ethnic, multi-racial and all that. So I think that's a key thing. If you look at even our Prime Minister Tan Sri Muhyiddin, he has not appeared so much on politics. He is more focused on what to be done, what needed to be done, what delivered, what deliverables and so on. Again, some people may question his motive. Oh, maybe he doesn't want to be in front. Well, whatever, the problem is whatever anybody do now, because it has been so overly politicized, everything will be seen with a
political lens.
Yes.
Then when that happens, it's going to be tough. But having said that, I think knowing Tan Sri Muhyiddin a little bit better than maybe some of us, he is very focused. He wants to get things done the proper way. He wants to build a consensus. Remember, many people say that he took over. But you must remember who really triggered the entire episode. And please, if you know who really triggered the entire episode, people will see the whole scenario a little bit kinder.
Okay. On that very cryptic note, we have to say thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights with us, Rais. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. But don't go anywhere, because right after this, there's going to be live coverage of that developing story in Sabah on the possible change of administration. Stay tuned for all the latest on this. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.